This is Holy Cross Component 1 Mock, and it's our mock number 3, question 5. So a little bit more tricky, this question. We have got some data, and we're comparing athletes and non-athletes. The scale on the left, it says rates of energy expenditure in joules per minute per kilogram, but we can just take this as amount of exercise. That's all we need to think about that. And then we are comparing one thing between the athletes and then comparing another thing. These two questions are quite similar to each other. One is we need to make sure we're talking about the right thing. So oxygen consumption, which is this, and then lactic acid, which is going to be that side. So in A we only want to compare these. Jobs that we have to do. It says describe, so we're going to talk about what goes up, what goes down, and so on, but in comparison to each other. So all our answers have got to be this happens to the athletes, whereas that happens to the non-athletes. It's got to be a comparison. And then don't forget to do this, suggest an explanation for these differences. But by that point you might have got 2 or 3 marks anyway. So let's start describing these figures. So when we look at the athletes, the number is always higher than the non-athletes. If you were drawing this as a little graph, just draw a little graph there, your athletes would be kind of always higher than the non-athletes. So if it was on a graph, that's what you'd say, but in the data it's harder to think about. So athletes have a higher rate of oxygen consumption, and we're saying it exactly like it's written there. And that's at all levels. And we could say that their maximum is much higher than the non-athletes. The maximum is much higher than non-athletes. We could give some data there, 58 centimetre cubed per minute per kilogram versus 45. We could talk about the levelling off. We could say between 1200 and 1400 energy expenditure, the athletes are still increasing, whereas the non-athletes have levelled off. So there's a difference, a comparison. So between 1200 to 1400 energy expenditure, athletes only rise by 1 centimetre cubed a minute, or horrible units these, aren't they? Kilogram. Whereas non-athletes do not rise. So there's some comparisons. You could come up with some more. You could say non-athlete, could do it from the other point of view. Non-athletes, don't rise as high, and so on. An explanation for this? Well, athletes have higher lung capacity, better circulatory system, that sort of thing, more mitochondria. So athletes have more efficient respiratory, circulatory systems, something like that, or maybe more mitochondria. And then we're doing the same job for the lactic acid, and we go, right, well, non-athletes produce more lactic acid, and they do it earlier than the athletes. So they're the two major points there. So as exercise increases, non-athletes produce more lactic acid than the athletes. Say athletes don't produce lactic acid until 1200. Energy expenditure. Whereas non-athletes produce lactic acid at 1000 energy expenditure. You could say a couple more comparisons there, but you've made a couple of points there, and you could use some different kind of numbers, or do it from either point of view. And we need an explanation. Well, with the athletes, we already mentioned it, the more efficient respiratory system would provide oxygen, and so there's no need for the anaerobic so soon. So athletes have a more efficient supply of oxygen for aerobic respiration. So quite difficult, some of that. And part C, during marathon running, protein might be used. What happens to the amino acids? Right. So you can burn amino acids. What is an amino acid? Hopefully you immediately sort of think of what an amino acid is. So we've got the amine end, then we've got a Q group, then our group there. And essentially what's going to happen is this amine group gets chopped off, and you've done this in your homeostasis and kidney. Deamination, the amine groups gets chopped off. That's going to disappear off, get converted to urea, and disappear off to the kidney, and you know about that. The other part, this 2-carbon chain is just going to enter the respiratory kind of cycles and pathways wherever it would be relevant for 2-carbon. So we are looking for this deamination So deamination, the amino group converted to urea and then excreted, and then what's left will then be entered into a Krebs cycle. You have 2 carbons go into the Krebs cycle. So we call this the what's left, the residue. It's actually converted to acetyl coenzyme A. Acetyl coenzyme A. You remember this from question 3. So at this sort of stage of the cycle, 2 carbon. And is oxidized in respiration. For example, Krebs cycle. Where does all this happen, all this chemistry? Well, think about chemistry, usually happens in the liver. I'm tempted to say kidney there, but that's where the excretion of the urea will occur. And then a nice little diagram just to wrap up with anaerobic respiration. Easier really to start off at the bottom in plants and fungi, so kind of fermentation. This is going to give you ethanol. That's a 2 carbon chain. So if we've got 3 carbon down to 2 carbon, we must have lost 1 carbon, and that's going to be CO2. So you're probably alright with those. These, you might be tempted to get these the wrong way around. And so you've got to remember this is the recycling of our electron carriers. The purpose of this is so we can produce more NAD that can be used in glycolysis. So we're actually using reduced NAD and producing normal NAD or oxidized NAD. Or you could have gone NAD and this could have been NADH possibly. So this is our regeneration of our carriers, so glycolysis can continue. So quite a tricky question, question 5.